안녕하세요. BTV 이동진의 파이아키아, 저는 이동진입니다. 특별한 두 분을 모셨습니다. 바로 맷 데이먼 씨 그리고 크리스토퍼 놀란 감독님이십니다. 안녕하세요. 네, 두 분 만나 뵙게 돼서 정말 반갑습니다. 사실은 이 훌륭한 영화에 대해서 저희가 이야기할 만한 충분한 시간이 없기 때문에 시작부터 제가 단도직입적으로 바로 질문을 드리도록 하겠습니다. 네, 감독님께 먼저 여쭤보겠습니다. 사실은 감독님께서 이 프로젝트 자체를 오래전부터 구상하신 것으로 제가 전해 들었습니다. 어떻게 보면 너무나 위대한 이야기지만 또 3,000년이나 된 이야기이기도 한데요. 이 영화를 영화화하시면서 이것을 꼭 영화화해야겠다라고 생각했던 이 이야기에서 가장 중요한 포인트를 어떤 부분에 매혹이 되셨는지 질문을 드리겠습니다.
As a filmmaker, you're looking for an opportunity. You're looking for a gap in movies that you can fill and hopefully bring something fresh to the audience. For me, it was a surprise to realize that this 3,000-year-old poem that's a foundational text of Western literature has been referenced in so many different ways by so many different films and television programs and books and everything, hadn't been told as a modern film. And the world of Greek mythology is very interesting to a lot of people. It's a very powerful thing to look back on. The poem itself, when you come to the text, is stunningly relevant and very accessible on a human level. And so for me, that just seemed a great opportunity to challenge myself to bring one of the great stories of all Western literature to the big screen and hopefully take the audience someplace they haven't been before.
네, 감사드리고요. 이번에 맷 데이먼 씨에게 질문을 드리겠습니다. 처음에 이제 이 배역이 처음 하시는 것으로서 오디세이아로 결정이 되셨을 때 내가 이 역을 하게 됐구나라고 했을 때 가장 먼저 어떤 생각이 떠올리셨는지, 한 가지 더 질문을 드린다면 그렇게 해서 영화 촬영을 다 마치고 완성이 되고 나서 극장에서 처음 이 영화를 보셨을 때 어떤 기분이 드셨는지 두 가지 질문 드립니다.
Well, my first thought, I was thrilled, obviously. It's an incredible role, an iconic role. I was mildly terrified, but knowing that Chris saw me in the role was very reassuring. And so I just immediately started thinking about how to go to work and how to start figuring out how I was going to play this character. And the experience was incredible and very challenging for all of us who were there. And so the first time I saw the film, I don't even know how much of it I could take in. I was very overwhelmed by it. And it's funny, when I had a much smaller part in the film Interstellar, and I watched the movie again 10 years after it was released, and it felt like I was watching it for the first time. So I think when you're so close to an experience, it can be hard at first to separate yourself from it and to look at it. And I'm glad I've seen the Odyssey now a few times, so now I've been able to take it in more.
And in 10 years, you're going to really love it.
I'm going to love it in 10 years.
그러시다면 또 추가적으로 질문 드리고 싶습니다. 사실은 이제 인터스텔라에서 감독님과의 영화에서 출연을 하신 적이 있었고요. 그리고 또 바로 직전에 오펜하이머에서 너무나 멋진 모습을 보여주셨습니다. 비교를 한다면 이번 오디세이에서 크리스토퍼 노란 감독님은 이전에 두 편을 찍을 때랑 어떤 모습이 달리 보이셨고 또 어떤 모습은 역시 여전한 똑같은 모습이셨는지 질문드리겠습니다.
Yeah, he was very similar. It was just a different set of problems we were contending with. None of those shoots were easy. On Interstellar, we were on a glacier, which was a very new experience for me. Every movie has its different set of challenges. This one was like making 6 different movies because each location was so different and so uniquely challenging. We all knew. I saw him challenged in ways I've never seen him challenged, but that was part of the joy of it. Was he had added this extra layer of difficulty in trying to do the entire film in IMAX, which provided a technical challenge to every single department on the film. The fact that all of us were being challenged in this way and looking at him challenging himself this way, and I've said before, it felt more like an expedition than a film. It felt like we were going to a place for the first time, like we were explorers almost. And so there was a great deal of patience among the departments. Nobody had ever tried to do this before. We were doing it all in camera because Chris likes to do as many practical effects as he can. And so there was a great spirit of camaraderie amongst the team that really was ultimately, whilst challenging, it was an incredibly joyful experience for everybody.
맷 데이먼 씨의 이 영화에서의 어떤 모습은 사실상 이 영화의 그 깊이를 그대로 담보하시는 게 아닌가라는 생각이 들고 영화를 통해서 그 연기를 하신 것에 깊은 감명을 받았습니다. 그래서 저는 이제 놀런 감독님한테 그 질문을 드리고 싶은데요. 맷 데이먼 씨를 오디세이라는 이 어떤 희대의 영웅적인 어떤 캐릭터에 이 배우를 떠올리시게 된 가장 큰 이유가 어떤 것인지를 먼저 여쭤보고 싶고요. 또 하나는 본인의 그런 선택이 직접 촬영장에서 촬영을 하면서 어떤 장면에서 내가 제대로 판단했구나, 이 사람을 캐스팅하길 정말 잘했구나라고 확신이 드셨는지 질문을 두 가지를 드리도록 하겠습니다.
I was looking for, or when I finished writing the script, because while I'm writing, I try not to think about actors at all. I try to just write the characters sort of from the inside, as it were, as if, they're real people and aspects of myself or whatever. Because you don't want to limit, if I've been thinking of Matt while I wrote the part, I'd be limiting the part. When the script was finished, I looked at it, really what I'm looking for and what Matt could bring to this, and I knew he could bring to this having worked with him before, is he's an actor who creates sensitivity and tremendous ability. He also has a really profound relationship with the audience. And Matt is somebody in movies that we trust. We trust him to take us on this journey. He can open things up to an audience in terms of the empathy, so people can understand what the story is, what the character is going through in a way. And that's what a great actor and a great movie star can bring to the role. And of course, with Matt, if you look at his work in the past, he's very often playing a very accessible, everyman character, but sometimes he's playing Jason Bourne and he's playing somebody who's essentially a superhero or a trained killer or that kind of thing. And Odysseus is all of those things. I also felt that the character in the poem, I tried to adapt it. It's a very complicated character. It's a complex character with a lot of different aspects. And I didn't want to have to shed all of those to make the character acceptable to the audience. And I felt that Matt would be able to find a way to take us through the story with all of those layers of the characterization in such a way that we would see things from his point of view. And so really I wanted an Odysseus who would take us on the journey and then allow us every now and again to step back and say, well, hang on, how did we get here? What's this guy really been doing? What's he really up to? And Matt is so capable of embracing all of those things in the natural talent that he brings to things, but also the discipline that he brings to the way in which he breaks the character down and plots the journey of the character. And, like a lot of the great actors I've worked with, Matt has an incredible sense of how the characterization is informing the story as a whole, and how we're moving through the narrative with the characters. And it would be hard for me to pull out any one particular moment, because every day I was asking Matt and watching him do things that very, very difficult, whether physically or in terms of the performance, in terms of the layers of it. Some of my favorite moments of working with Matt on the film were very physical, to do with, being out on the boats. Or I was telling him the other day, there's a shot that's not actually in the film. I didn't need it in the end, but where the boat pulls up to a beach and he effortlessly jumps off the boat into the deep water and runs up the beach, and then all his men follow, and they all fell over themselves. They no one could do it the way he had done it, which I thought was pretty fantastic. As I say, didn't wind up using it in the film, but then a lot of the moments are really treasure in terms of making the film. We're watching the quiet moments. For me, the scene between Odysseus and Penelope after Odysseus comes home has always been the most important in the story, and the one I was the most worried about and nervous about, and how is that going to be? And we tried so hard, everybody working on the film, to put the things in place that would make the scene work, from the set design to the cinematography and everything else. But ultimately, it's about these two people coming together at a time in life when there's no judgment. It's really just a very honest conversation between two people who are trying to find each other again.
Moving to Korea is exciting, but choosing a right internet plan can be confusing. Should I go with the prepaid or the postpaid? The 3-month plan, 1-year plan, a 3-year plan?
Well, if you're a foreign resident in Korea, this video could save you a lot of money. Insider tips from a pro at Korea's #1 internet. And if you want details in English, check the link in the description or in the pinned comment.
네, 오디세이라는 인물은 지금 감독님께서 말씀하신 것처럼 이제 무엇보다도 굉장히 복잡한 인물로 이야기해 주셨습니다. 맷 데이먼 씨에게 여쭤보고 싶습니다. 사실은 이 오디세이아라는 인물은 지난 3,000년간 뭐 문학이든 영화든 수많은 매체를 통해서 정말 다양하게 해석이 되어 왔고 사실은 원래 원작이 되었던 서사시 속에서 오디세이아와 이 영화에서의 오디세이도 사실은 모습들이 굉장히 다릅니다. 이 복잡한 인물, 모순된 인물을 연기하시면서 무엇보다도 맷 데이먼 씨께서는 이 인물은 어떤 인물이다라고 생각을 하시면서 중심을 잡아가셨는지 질문 드립니다.
Well, there are myriad interpretations you can get from reading the poem. Luckily, I had Chris's script, and that was very specific, and I could see immediately what this Odyssey was and what the story was, and we had conversations starting 6 months before about the script, about what he needed from me, and the scenes were beautifully written, and it was very, very clear kind of what this story was. You know, I had the poem with me at all times, and I could refer to it if I needed. But I've found in working with Chris now 3 times, his screenplays are very dense and very specific, and when you do a play in theater, what they teach you is everything you need to know you can investigate in the text. It's there. I feel that way about his screenplays. And if I'm looking for an answer, I can go back and carefully read, and everything I need to know is there.
맷 데이먼 씨께서는 뭐 탁월한 배우이시지만 또 사실은 오스카에서 각본상을 받으실 정도로 뛰어난 각본가이기도 하셨으니까 그런 측면에서도 각본에도 훌륭함을 잘 보실 수 있는 그런 위치가 아니셨을까 싶습니다.
I think a lot of people who read these screenplays appreciate how incredibly well they're written, and I've said that many times. I think Chris is a victim of his own talent because he's known as such a brilliant director. I think sometimes his writing is overshadowed by that. But the screenplays that I've read of his are among the best I've ever seen, and this one's no different. And I felt that way about Oppenheimer as well. Oppenheimer was based on a Pulitzer Prize winning, very dense book called American Prometheus, and what he was able to distill and put in that adaptation, it was like it's really an incredible talent, because to put in a screenplay that's maybe 160 pages, and condense and really get the elements that you need from this giant book is quite a skill. And the Odyssey is obviously, 24 books or something of and Homer used time in very interesting ways and jumps around in time. And the screenplay was built. I felt like a Swiss watch. It was just incredibly well architectured, and I hate to say it, but he is a hell of a writer.
감독님께 이런 그 연장선상에서 질문드리겠습니다. 호모의 원작 자체가 사실은 3,000년이나 됐음에도 불구하고 플롯이 굉장히 복잡합니다. 근데 이 영화를 보면서 이제 감독님의 영화를 우리가 즐기는 너무나 매혹당하는 여러 가지 이유 중에 하나가 사실은 또 플롯에도 있는데요. 거기에 관한 질문 하나 드리고 싶습니다. 이 영화의 시제는 사실은 오디세이를 기준으로 본다면 오디세이아가 칼립소 섬에서 사로잡혀서 7년을 보내는 순간에 영화가 시작되고 있습니다. 그러니까 이 영화의 현재 속에서 사실상 칼립소 섬에서는 영원에 가까운 시간을 보내고 있지만 그 시간이 사실상 정지되어 있다라고 이제 볼 수 있을 텐데요. 다른 한편 이타카에서 페넬로페도 마찬가지의 정지된 시간을 보내는 것 같습니다. 왜냐하면 페넬로페는 낮에 짠 자기의 수의를 저녁이 되면 다시 풀어서 그 노동과 시간을 되돌리면서 그 시간을 사실상 무화시키고 있기 때문입니다. 질문 드리고 싶은 것은 감독님께서 지난 세월 사실은 이제 이 두 사람의 이렇게 멈춰져 있는 시간이 이타카로 가게 되면 본격적으로 그야말로 제대로 흐르게 되는 셈인 것인데요. 감독님의 영화에서 이 플롯과 구조가 너무 중요하다는 것을 생각하게 된다면 이 복잡한 구조 속에서 플롯과 시제 속에서 감독님은 어떤 것을 가장 중시해서 하셨는지를 질문 드리고 싶습니다.
I mean, it's a very good question. A lot of, I think, excellent observation about how the timeline works, and really drawn from the original poem. I'm somebody who's used non-linear structures in my films a lot, and I've been asked about that a lot, as if that were an anomaly. It was interesting and humbling to come back to the oldest work of Western literature and realize that had an incredibly adventurous non-linear structure. And I wanted to stick to it as close as I could. I mean, obviously I had to make changes, but for me, it was important to maintain that sense of limbo, really. And in simplifying Odysseus' story in terms of where he is when we first find him and how that then plays into his coming home, what I really wanted to maintain was a sense of identification with him, with Penelope back home, and then with Telemachus, his coming of age story, his idea that he's put this father on a pedestal who he doesn't really remember and knows him really through mythology, through song. And so we begin with Travis Scott as the bard sort of singing the song of Odysseus. It's really all about trying to set up these three different viewpoints on the story and set up the expectation for the audience that they will indeed come together. Obviously, for a lot of the film, we're on the journey with Odysseus. And so Odysseus is the strongest point of identification. But to me, it was also very important to use the structure and use the nonlinear structure to be able to maintain the other points of view on Odysseus, the other ways of looking at this character, and then try and reconcile those when he arrives back in Ithaca.
네, 그런 말씀을 들으니까 사실은 덩케르크의 구조가 떠오르기도 하고요. 사실 이번에 맷 데이먼 씨에게 또 질문을 드리고 싶습니다. 그러니까 영화 속에서 가장 중요한 사건은 어떻게 보면 과거의 사건 중에서 트로이 목마에서 그 전투라고 볼 수도 있고 학살이라고 볼 수도 있는 그 사건이라고 말씀드릴 수 있겠습니다. 맷 데이먼 씨께서는 사실은 극 중에서 이 장면을 어떻게 보면 두 번 연기한 것처럼 저한테는 보입니다. 왜냐하면 메넬라우스가 텔레마코스한테 이야기를 할 때 영화의 전반부에서 트로이 전투가 처음 묘사가 되고요. 후반부에서 이제 오디세이가 그 페넬로페한테 이야기를 할 때 다시 한번 묘사가 됩니다. 하지만 두 장면의 맥락이나 감정 같은 것은 완전히 다른데요. 배우 입장에서는 하나의 장면을 두 번의 다른 어떤 스타일로 연기를 하셔야 될 것 같은 그런 느낌이 들어서 이 각각의 장면들을 어떻게 마음가짐으로 혹은 생각으로 연기하셨는지 질문 드립니다.
Yeah, well, without revealing too much to those who haven't seen the movie yet, the Siege of Troy takes on, different meanings depending on who's telling the story and where in the movie we are. But that siege, as we shot it, is basically told chronologically, and so we shot it in order. And so it was I think pretty easy for us to know where we were in the story. It didn't feel like we had to play the siege twice. It was the siege itself told a story that we needed to tell once, and that story is the audience hears that story in the film depending on who's telling it. I don't know if that makes sense, if that's a good way to explain it, but it's not like we had to go back and
No, because the change is when the gates open. And so we leave the point when Menelaus tells the story, we leave it at that point. And so, the way we were making it and the way I was directing it, and the way I was asking to play it wasn't, the change is inherent in the text. The change is inherent in the action. And then the division at the gates opening was always intended, that we would see it divided in that way. But so I think, it was quite a natural break
when
point,
you see Odysseus's joy when the gates open, right, and he's screaming with joy, and then he marches into the city, and then that's where we leave him in that first.
또 OTT 구독료만 빠지네.
OTT 유목민 생활은 그만. 이제 BTV 플러스 맥스로 한 번에 월 6,600원만 추가하면 모든 장르 컨텐츠는 물론 실시간 채널과 지상파 3사까지 한 번에. 가족은 각자 보고 싶은 컨텐츠를 마음껏. 구독은 줄이고 컨텐츠는 늘리고. BTV 플러스 맥스.
네, 감독님께 이제 오펜하이머라는 또 다른 탁월한 작품을 우리가 바로 직전에 보았습니다. 그러다 보니까 이 두 영화 사이를 자연스럽게 연결하게 되는데요. 어떻게 본다면 두 영화는 보기에는 굉장히 다른 영화처럼 보이지만 사실은 착점이라든지 어떤 문제의식을 공유한 게 아닌가라는 생각이 들었습니다. 무슨 이야기인가 하면 오펜하이머도 그렇고 이번 영화 오디세이도 그렇고 둘 다 어떤 탁월한 리더십을 발휘하는 주인공이 각지에 흩어져 있는 대단히 뛰어난 어떤 그런 사람들을 한 군데 모아서 본인이 뛰어난 아이디어를 내고 그것을 통솔력을 발휘해서 마침내 전쟁에 승리하게 되는 전쟁 영웅에 관한 이야기입니다. 하지만 그 두 전쟁 영웅은 전쟁이 정작 승리하게 된 다음부터는 자신이 한 일에 대해서 성찰하고 거기에 대해서 굉장히 괴로워한다는 공통점을 갖고 있는데요. 그 연장선상에 감독님께 이런 질문을 드리고 싶습니다. 그렇다면 감독님께서는 오래전 트로이 전쟁과 2차 세계대전과 혹은 지금 문명이 처해야 있는 어떤 위기라든지 수많은 어떤 현상을 상황을 보고 기본적으로 이 세 가지를 보시는 문제의식은 같으신 건지 궁금해서 질문드리겠습니다.
I think what I found in adapting the Odyssey was so many things that Homer outlines, both in the Iliad and the Odyssey, seem alien to us. They seem of another time and another culture at first. And then the longer you live with them and the more you work with them, suddenly they become stunningly relevant. They come into focus in an extraordinary way. And this concept of xenia, the idea of what we refer to in the film as Zeus's law, the idea that you might be a humble beggar in disguise, but you might be a humble beggar. You might appear to be that, but you could be a god in disguise. So I should treat you with the same respect that I would expect to be treated with, and the same hospitality. At first, that seemed like just a sort of interesting aspect of their world. But as you work with it, and as you start to remove the theological underpinning, the idea that you might be a god in disguise, you realize that mutual respect for human beings, it was the only practical way for that society to function, for that civilization to function. Because as soon as you left the house, you're throwing yourself on the mercy of strangers. And for civilization to grow, for society to function, it's essential. And the longer I work with it, the more I realize that nothing has changed in that regard. And indeed, that basic principle of mutual respect is essential and may even be a definition of civilization. And so all of conflict that violates that puts us into this paradoxical area that's impossible to reconcile with that tension between what happens with the breakdown of that. I think that in different aspects and in different degrees, anytime you're dealing with conflict, anytime you're looking at, human conflict, you're looking at that issue. And so I think Homer, once again, I think we're able to find in Homer something very, very important and elemental, rewards examination.
네, 시간이 5분밖에 남지 않아서 한 가지씩만 질문드리고 마치도록 하겠습니다. 맷 데이먼 씨께 마지막 질문 드리겠습니다. 이 영화는 사실 시각적으로 탁월한 영화이지만 동시에 또 대사가 또 굉장히 중요한 작품이기도 합니다. 영화 속에서 이제 오디세이를 맡은 맷 데이먼 씨께서는 길게 이야기를 들어야 되는 장면도 있고 반대로 길게 이야기를 해야 되는 장면도 있습니다. 대표적으로 길게 이야기하는 장면은 페넬로페한테 마지막으로 고백하는 장면이 있을 거고요. 대표적으로 가장 길게 들었던 장면은 이 죽은 망령들로부터 차례대로 그들의 이야기를 듣는 이야기, 그런 연기를 하셨습니다. 제가 궁금한 것은 이렇게 대사가 중요한 영화에서 연기를 하시는 분으로서 이 두 장면에서 듣는 연기를 할 때와 말을 하시는 연기를 할 때 어떤 차이가 있었는지를 질문드리고 싶습니다.
Well, listening is everything. And I don't really draw a distinction between speaking and listening. It's more about engagement. In some ways, you're always at the mercy of the ability of the actor opposite you. And in this movie, I was just surrounded by extraordinary actors, and it's more about together creating the energy and of this thing of going together to this place. And Chris is very good about creating a full world around you because everything's shot practically. So you're really there. You're really, whether you're on a boat or on a mountaintop or in Hades, you really do feel like you're there. And the only distinction being in preparation, I think I work a lot more to make sure that I know all my lines exactly right, particularly shooting in IMAX because I don't want to waste any film. And sometimes when I have to listen a lot, I don't read the speeches of the actor. I'll be familiar with them, but I'll want to hear them from the actor so that I can really hear them for the first time. So that would be the only distinction in preparation. But for the most part, I don't draw much distinction between the two.
마지막 질문 감독님께 드리도록 하겠습니다. 시청각적인 압도적인 영화적인 체험을 주는 작품입니다. 영화를 보면서 이제 놀랐던 것은 사실은 이 오래전 이야기들이 굉장히 새롭게 우리에게 다가오면서도 동시에 이 작품이 굉장히 시각적으로 굉장히 고전적인 품격을 가지고 있다고 그럴까요? 그러니까 어떻게 보면 두 가지가 모순됨에도 불구하고 두 가지가 이 영화가 모두 다 갖고 있다는 어떤 질감적인 측면에서 놀라운 부분이 있습니다. 시청각적인 체험으로서 감독님은 이 영화를 기본 원칙으로 어떻게 만들고 싶으셨는지 가장 제일 원칙이 있다면 어떤 것이었는지 질문드립니다.
I think for me, what's always top of mind when I'm talking to my director of photography, Hoyte van Hoytema, really what we're always talking about is a three-dimensional reality. And we don't think in terms of the box around the image. We think in terms of where are we taking the audience in relation to the characters and the environments that they're in? Where are we putting that camera? Are we close to somebody? Are we close to a group of people? Are we wide? Are we up on top of the mountain with the people? Are we down below? And for me, the guiding principle usually is to try and be as close to the protagonist as possible, whoever the protagonist of the scene is, to try and see things from their point of view and really try and block things out that way. But it's a three-dimensional approach. And so it's one that can be classical in its structure, in the editing rhythms, but in the particulars can be grittier and looser because we're not necessarily hung up on a two-dimensional composition. We're trying to use the camera in a very three-dimensional way.
감사합니다. 오늘 말씀 너무 감사드리고요. 한국에서 남은 일정도 잘 하시고 돌아가시면 감사하겠습니다. 고맙습니다.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great questions. Thank you.
Thank you.